The most infuriating thing about Brandon is the apologies. He is sorry for everything. Like, whenever he has to do anything, prefaces it with an apology. He apologizes a few times in the middle, and then at the end he concludes with, "I'm sorry." I mean, it's an aspect of his personality that I can only admire, because he always feels like he needs to make the other person feel comfort. And he always feels like he's imposing in some way, or like he's disappointed somebody in some way. So the biggest part of his vocabulary is synonyms for "I'm sorry."
The most annoying thing about Steve to me, our relationship's fucking great, but he is an unashamed farter. So I guess I remember, like, okay, sorry, buddy. There's a thing in America called safety and doorknob. If you fart, you have to say safety, and if you don't say safety, someone can come and they can beat on you until you touch a doorknob. And ever since I've met him, he farts and he goes, "Safety," and automatically always. I remember we were staying for our first World Series of Poker. We stayed at the Imperial Palace, which is gone. And we were staying in the same room. And I was writing, and he was asleep. And he was dead asleep. And he fucking rips one. He rips one in his sleep. And he was like, "Safety."
Our friendship developed out of our shared interest in poker. But it's obviously more than that. We see the world the same way in a lot of ways. We both value other people to a greater extent than a lot of other gamblers do. A lot of other gamblers just think of other people as, machines they can crank money out of. And neither one of us can stomach cruelty. That's the number one thing that I think aligns us, is that cruelty is the intentional harm, or getting satisfaction out of harming someone else, is the lowest form of satisfaction. And I think that is where we are so specifically aligned. And that's made our friendship seem more multidimensional. As we became closer friends, I started to learn more about his personal life, and he would be in these awkward situations with his girlfriends here and there. At one point, he needed a place to live. He didn't have liquid cash. He couldn't really afford to get a place. He was thinking about maybe moving at some point. So I offered to let him stay here at the studio. We have dormitory rooms here at the studio, and often we don't need all of the space that we have. I've done this for other people as well, but specifically for Brandon, he needed a place to live, and so I let him stay in the studio for a year or so. And he became part of the culture here in the studio. All the staff, treated him like a kindred spirit and like another part of the surroundings. So it was nice having him around. It was nice, having someone here that had a kind of a peek into another parallel universe that I was part of. And also it was nice just to be able to offer a little break in the chaos that had become his personal life. Don't worry about finding a place. Just crash here for a while. Don't worry about, trying to make rent. You don't have to pay rent. Just hang out here and take that off your mind, and it'll be fine. For a while, I was putting him into the games when I had more money than he did. I was putting him into some of the games, not as a business, but because I wanted to see him playing. And I wanted to see him doing the thing that he was naturally great at. At one point, he was in the hole kind of a lot, and then relatively quickly after that, he dug himself out of the hole, and it was really satisfying. That moment when he yeah, we're even. That's great. That moment was very satisfying, because it meant that he'd been on a sustained run of doing well and getting better and getting paid for it.
So when 2014 started, I was playing every day pretty much at the Horseshoe. Our normal stakes were 40-80. That was the biggest mixed game that was going. Every now and again we'd do a 75-150, but it didn't happen too much. It was the most I had been grinding ever, and it was going to be my biggest World Series of Poker schedule ever. I didn't play a lot of tournaments. In general, I just mostly stuck to cash games, and tournaments were kind of my reprieve from the cash game grind. But I always had success in them. It always felt like a fun format. You have one life, and like, how are you going to manage this life? The idea of winning a bracelet didn't really mean anything to me. Actually, like, winning a bunch of money wasn't really important to me either. I just wanted to like win. I don't know. That's all. Like, just winning. The competing was the appeal for me. Started a thread on 2+2 titled "Win a World Series of Poker bracelet to sell on eBay." I decided to put myself out there and be like, I'm like, if anyone's ever looking for like a good dark horse fantasy draft, I think this is going to be the year. Showed up to World Series that year and like won the first event I played, which was like a 1K PLO. I think it was the biggest PLO field to date at that point. And then went on to have a crazy rest of the series.
He's a really creative thinker, but his rationale for the way he develops the reads that he's inducing in other people is unique. Like, I think he's a really gifted poker mind. He's got a very creative approach. He's done the background work to know mathematically that what he's saying is sound. He's not just making it up. And that's gratifying as well, to like have someone articulate an approach to the game which is not purely like copycat instruction, but is more of a developed personal style, which is reinforced with the math of the situation.
After winning the PLO bracelet, I wound up taking second in the 10K Raz, which was fucking devastating because like Raz was the format that I played the most, heads up in particular. I'm not especially happy with how I played, but that bracelet would have meant a lot to me. I wound up getting third in Limit Hold'em, which I felt like was as much as I deserved in that tournament. So that one wasn't very devastating. It did put me in a good POY situation, which wasn't something I thought about too much. And I think I used that maybe as an excuse to play the 50K PPC, which is like the dream tournament for all the mixed game players. The Limit Hold'em finished as late reg was going for the 50K. It was like the perfect excuse, all of that to jump in there last second. Playing with Doyle was epic, like legendary to me. Like, Raz is his favorite game. It's my favorite game, and we played like some fun Raz pots, and I made a fold in one specific spot that was like 4 ways. I told him I thought he was like up to no good or whatever. We had like a little banter, and he gave me a wink and did the thing I thought he was going to do, and then we just like had some good dialogue after that. Next year, he tried to buy like a piece of my 50K, and I had so little of myself, and I had sold out. I couldn't give it to him, and it hurt me deeply. I don't identify as a poker player, so I could give a fuck if someone thinks I'm terrible. But it was like the one tournament where I really tried my hardest. And it was cool to be able to put on that performance in front of a legend like Doyle. And then I remember Oppenheim came up to me during lunch and was like, what's your name, blah, blah, blah. There's some interesting spots. I wound up taking second to John Hennigan in that tournament. Kind of overplayed a PLO spot, which I regret, but that was a really cool experience. After World Series 2014, I think I wound up cashing, I think it was like 1.5 million. I had a pretty small percentage of myself, honestly, and I actually, I wanted to keep things easy for myself for the most part. So I put what I was going to send to people who weren't in Chicago in the bank, and then the rest of it I wound up taking in bricks or whatever in my backpack, just because it seemed really so absurd, I guess. It's so stupid. Just to feel like the Monopoly man for a second. So I took like $250,000 in cash or whatever, and I came home and I had this backpack filled with money, So naturally, lining the bottom of this mattress with $250,000 made the most sense to me. And that's what I did. At any given point, if you're walking through the studio, like, you could just lift up this mattress and rob me blind.
I've been playing with Steve probably for, I'd say, a year or two before knowing who he was. And then there was just a talk about Nirvana one day, and he's like, well, I produced Nirvana. And I'm like, oh, no way. And I look him up on my phone when I'm sitting there, and I call my friend, my buddy Dave, who's a huge Nirvana fan. And he's like, no way, take a picture. You know, like, that's how I kind of got started with Steve. And he's a really nice guy, good poker player.
I didn't know he was in the music business, and my wife is a huge music junkie. My ex-wife, she's a huge music junkie, and I always tell him about who was at the game or a bad beat or something. She goes, wait, I'm gonna go, yeah, Steve Albini. She goes, oh my God, you know Steve Albini? I'm like, yeah, Harry Potter? She's like, yeah. Steve always makes me laugh because he's the guy that, he's so nice, but at the poker table, he's like when he's losing, he's one of the biggest dicks there is. You know, you'll beat him and be like, what the fuck? And then, you know, like if you've played Deuce to 7, you know, you'll beat him and make an 8, and I'll be like, what the fuck? And then he'll roll over like Jack 10, 9, 6, 4, and it's like, dude, what the fuck you doing? You know what I mean? But that's Steve. But he's like, I mean, we're really good friends outside the poker table, but you know, it's just funny how it translates to his temper. Oh, and I saw his band play one time too, not my style. I didn't even know what the fuck they were saying. I had no idea what it even meant.
I do see references to the Steve Albini sound specifically with respect to rock music, and it's fair. I do work with a lot of rock bands that have a particular high key energy to them, and there are certain aspects of my skill set which are finely tuned toward working on that style of music. So if a band comes in with those reference points, like, we're familiar with these records you did with Nirvana and PJ Harvey and the Pixies, and we want a similar atmosphere or we want a similar approach, then, you know, you've come to the right guy. You know, so I understand that as a shorthand for describing what I do in the studio. But my experience of working in the studio is broader than that. Like, your average journalist or your average casual music listener may only be familiar with 3 or 4 records that I've worked on, right? But I am familiar with the thousands of sessions that I did that were not like that. I don't consider myself a record producer. So my role is a purely technical one, where they have an idea, the band has an idea about how they want their music to sound, and my job is to manifest that some way, do all the technical stuff required to make it sound like a volcano, or make it sound like someone dropping silverware on the stairs, or whatever, you know, like that. Whatever their idea about their music is, my job is to realize that idea. And to me, that's not a creative role necessarily. There is some creative thinking about problem solving, for example. But the ideas that are on the record, like if you drop the needle on the record and you're hearing all of these ideas coming out, those aren't my ideas, that's the band's ideas. Most people who do most jobs are paid for their time. Like if someone comes to repair your washing machine, which is something that I had to do the other day, I had to pay someone to come and repair my washing machine. I paid him for his time and he was happy, you know. That's the way most jobs work. Somehow, in the studio environment and in the record business, there developed a scheme of paying people that was not like that, where if I worked on your record as a producer, you would have to pay me a percentage of your income forever. That just became a normal practice in the music business. It's called a royalty payment, and royalties paid to someone like me or a record producer would come directly out of your pocket as a musician. Like the money that would otherwise be paid to you is diverted and paid to me, right? And because my background is being in bands and my sympathies are with the bands, that way of compensating just seems insane to me. It just seems crazy and insane and unethical, and I just won't participate in it. So when I work on a record for somebody, they're paying me for my time, and that's it. If they make $40 off of this record, it's all theirs. If they make $40 million off this record, It's all theirs. You know, none of that is any of my business.
You know, if he would have just taken like royalties off like Nirvana or whatever, he'd be good. You come here, you play your music. I'm just doing the janitorial work. I just make your record, like that. Pay me for that service, and then you guys live your life. And I really respect that.
The guy that fixed my washing machine, I wouldn't expect to have to pay him an honorarium every year that the washing machine keeps working. That just doesn't. Nothing else works this way. You have this band who've dreamed their music up out of nothing. There was nothing, and then they applied themselves to their creativity, and they made this music out of nothing, right? They did all the hard work of arranging the music and learning it, and they rehearsed it together, and they also went and hit the boards and built an audience that would be willing to listen to their music. And they developed a relationship with that audience, and that audience relationship is what they're trading on for the rest of their life, And then they make this record, which is all of their performing. It's them playing the music. They made it. It's them. It's not me controlling them like puppets. It's them making this music out of their own, strength of will. If they're successful in that and they convince people to buy those records, it just seems crazy for me to reach in there and try to take a piece out of it, because I didn't do any of that. I sat in a comfortable chair and I pushed some buttons and I moved some microphones around. And I said things like, how was that? Like, that's my job. My job is to do the technical side of things and then say things like, are you happy? I don't play many tournaments. I'm not a tournament player by disposition. I won a bracelet in stud in 2018, and I can't explain how little expectation I had going into that tournament. It was a short trip. I was only going to play a couple of tournaments, and up until that point, I had never made a final table. I had always pictured like the actual winning of a bracelet. That's for professionals. That's for serious poker players, people whose life's work is playing poker. It never occurred to me that I would win a bracelet. Like, it was never even a fantasy of mine to win a bracelet. I did fantasize about getting to a final table and being there at the end of a tournament and seeing all of this high-level play up close for consequential money. Like that, to me, that's the experience that I wanted to have. And so when I made it to the final table, I felt like, this is great. Like, I've just done it. This is the accomplishment I wanted to make, was get to a final table. And then I just kept playing poker, and it just kept going well for me.
I find out he made the final table, and he's had some close calls, and he did it in an event that like he loves, which is great. And the table's just like packed with bracelet winners, with bracelets basically. Ashton and I bust out of the 50K and know that Steve is at the final table. So this is like the least depressed, like zero depression busting out of the 50K, which is a rarity. So we just watched Steve navigate through a super tough final table. By then, a whole bunch of our friends had gathered around the rail, and we were like clapping and stomping anytime he'd won a pot. To his embarrassment, for sure, he was like, "Guys, please, like, fucking chill."
When I get heads up with Jeffrey Lisandro, great player, bunch of bracelets, all in stud disciplines, like great player, I could not have expected to beat Jeffrey Lisandro heads up. My expectation was to, play well, be happy with second, maybe make a deal, save a little, that kind of thing.
Then it went quiet for a while. Like Steve, again, went from having most of the chips to like a 3-1 dog, then back into contention, loses them all back again. Honestly, just wasn't looking good. And then just put his head down and grinded back. Once he got back to above even after having such a deficit, like this was one spot where I'm like, there's just no way. Like he can't have like come this far to lose. Like he's for sure just gonna win. And like he just coasted the rest of the way. We all fucking went crazy, obviously. Like, he grabbed his bracelet and started like fucking helicoptering that shit like everywhere. And
it was a kind of a surreal experience when we played the final heads-up hand and I won the tournament, because it sort of dawned on me at that moment that I had won the tournament, because up until that point I'd never considered winning the tournament. So actually winning it was as much of a surprise to me as it was to everybody else. So the bracelet ceremonies at the World Series of Poker are kind of a two-way street. Like, on one hand, it's your one opportunity to say something nice about the people who have been kind to you and taught you things about poker and helped you out. But also, if you're not on stage, if you're in the game and the game is paused while you're waiting for this fucking bracelet ceremony to be over, the last thing you want is somebody reading the phone book and saying thank you after every name. It's just tedious. So I tried to be as succinct as I could while still being genuine.
he came up, accepted his bracelet, and then spent the whole bracelet ceremony like talking about me. And like, it really touched me, really moved me. And I think, I mean, that's just the kind of guy he is. But yeah, just kind of giving those moments to everybody else, you know?
In my bracelet speech, when I won my bracelet and I got to tell the whole world what I thought about the world for 4.5 minutes before they started booing at me, the most important thing for me was to tell the rest of the poker community how much Brandon had meant to me in helping me become a better poker player, and what a good friend he was, and how his support had made the difference in me from being just a mediocre player to being a player who actually had some bright and lucid moments. And a lot of that I wanted to attribute to my friendship with Brandon. And I described him as the Iron Giant of poker. And I thought that was such an apt analogy. The animated film about the Iron Giant, about this space weapon robot who has a heart of gold and doesn't really want to be a weapon. He just wants to help people.
Do it again, man. The first time was
he's so massive and powerful and everything. And he finally realizes that he was made as a weapon, and it breaks his heart, the Iron Giant. So I described Brandon as the Iron Giant of poker, thinking that was going to bring the fucking house down. And he still hasn't seen the fucking movie. Like, he has no idea what I'm talking about when I say this. Like, I tried to get him to watch the movie, didn't watch the movie. Tried to get him to watch it after I told him all this stuff, didn't watch the movie.
I was just moved. I mean, I was extremely moved, and it was so cool to see my buddy like up there holding up, like, I don't know.
I think that's true between you and me. Like winning the bracelet was a cool experience for me, but seeing you win a bracelet was cooler.
100%.
Yeah, by far, that's my favorite World Series of Poker memory, is like being there when Brandon won his second bracelet. That was it. For sure. I have to say, though, like, a lot of that is imbued in me from being part of the music scene, where, especially in the punk rock era, like, nobody got anything done on their own. Like, nobody achieved anything on their own. Absolutely every part of it was a group effort. Every single thing that happened was because there were a whole bunch of people who were all coming together to make the experience more amazing for all of us, right? And I'm extremely lucky that in my circle of friends in poker, I think all of us want the experience of playing poker to be fucking awesome. I think if there's a driving impulse, that's what it is. For my practical existence, living in Chicago is great. It's in the middle of the country. I have access to all the other big cities in the Midwest, everywhere. And there's O'Hare's a hub airport. I can get anywhere in the world from here. Things like the art and culture and music scene here are second to none. Like, the people that I know in the music scene here are the people that I would take a bullet for. Socially and culturally, I really enjoy Chicago. It's a progressively minded city, but it's also a very working class city. Like, everyone here is working to get things done. It's not a bunch of people daydreaming and, making distant plans. Everybody here is used to having to get things done. And so you don't find a lot of people who are like beholden to their dreams and not accomplishing things. You see people just working day to day, getting their shit together and getting things done. It's a very, very simple kind of existence here, but I find it immensely rewarding. In 2014, Brandon had a huge year at the World Series, and that that opened up a lot of options for him. It gave him the opportunity to travel and pursue poker more seriously as a career. He had a relationship that, for reasons for his access to games and poker and her access to things in show business, for lack of a better term, they both thought it would be a good idea for them to leave Chicago and go to the West Coast. And so they were in LA for a while, and Brandon was playing in the games in LA. And then, I'm not really certain why, but the games in Los Angeles started getting harder to get into for him. Partly because he's a good player and good players don't get invited, but also just the way the games were operating politically was extremely difficult for him to navigate, because you kind of had to bribe your way into some of these games, and you had to be fairly ruthless about getting into the games when the fish were there and that sort of stuff. And that's just not his personality. Brandon would prefer to just put his name on the list and get called, you know?
I documented my experience playing in these big commerce games until I had enough terrible experiences. Moved to Vegas. Steve and I'd fly out to Chicago every now and again. He flew out to Vegas and we'd get together. Over the pandemic, we wound up just leaving Zoom on for the most part, and I would just share we would just share screens, I guess, and kind of keep each other company through the grind. And that was really nice. We built just a small little group of our friends who play in the quarter game. They could just kind of come and go and keep us company.
So during the pandemic, a lonely time for most, I got really into listening to gay hip hop because I needed needed a pick me up. And I grew up I listening to some rap and some hip hop, Nas, Nas back then, more Kendricky now, I guess. There's a lot of nostalgia with the great old school hip hop feel. That's not the fuck bitches get money as much. And gay hip hop is the complete opposite of standard fuck bitches get money, whatever. And it's all just about
sucking dicks.
Getting that ass, putting your ass out. And it's fucking evolved.
Yeah.
So I have this very catered 60 song gay hip hop playlist.
That's it. His grind playlist is a litany of just obscene titles, obscene artist names. Every single song has got these sexual boasts, but they're all from this position of being the best bottom, you know?
And it's great because there'll be times, cause I during pandemic, I just played a bunch of higher stakes private games online. There's a good amount of money in play, and there'll be spots where I'm bluffing, raising a river, and you can feel your heart rate kind of come up. And then all of a sudden,
in the background, somebody says, "And eat that booty like it's fried," and then that takes the steam off of the whole thing, and everything is no, I don't care what happens now. That was great. That was a perfect moment.
Steve likes to name things. Steve likes to give titles to things, and then I like to get excited by them, and then we go, yeah, and then it turns into an episode.
One of the first things that I named that I'm very proud of is when you are in a pot that's a substantial pot, and you have a hand that will be made by one very specific card, either that particular card or that particular rank of card, and then that card shows up on the turn like you ordered it out of a catalog. That's a catalog turn. Or if, let's say you've got a hand that needs a very particular kind of flop, and you get exactly the flop you need, that's a catalog flop, right? A little satisfaction there as a guy who likes words. That made me feel good. And then it went weird, and we started naming everything.
Yeah.
All the different pairs and all the different...
You started naming all the pairs. Kings are Kingles.
Kingles.
Steve named Kings Kingles, as one does. And the King of Spades wound up
the Undertaker.
Yeah. Pair of Kings is Kingles.
Yeah.
3 Kings is sexual harassment.
Right.
And then
4 Kings is WrestleMania.
Yes. If you call 3 bets cold,
taking 3 to the face is
bukkake.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then Yeah. Never mind on the last one. We'll pass on that one.
Yeah. So 9s are fun because 9s
for
is
sure.
is ningy ning,
Yeah.
right? And then 3 is ningy ningy ningy, and then 4 is ningy 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 ning ning ning.
No. It's no. Like 9's full of 10s is ningy 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 ting ting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. The red balloon story originated from the private game,
The fancy
Danny's game,
fancy schmancy game.
Fancy Schmancy. So for your birthday, you get to pick whatever series of games that you want to play. Like,
And there's a cake at dinner.
Yes, and a decorative balloon that's one single balloon that's tied to the back of your chair. And inevitably, no matter what, it's always the birthday boy. It's usually the birthday boy. So the birthday boy gets slaughtered.
Yeah.
And has reloaded like 3 times and is sitting like defeated. Like, this like single balloon, the sad balloon like floating.
Yeah,
above their
like
head.
clockwork on your birthday, you get to pick the games. Everybody's playing your best games at whatever stakes you want, and you get fucking destroyed. It's like clockwork. And you're just sitting there drained and busted and broke and furious at 4 a.m. with this little balloon hanging over your head. Tingle, tingle, tingle.
And then the following year, Andy Kaczynski and I were bemoaning our like shit series and came up with the idea that it would every time somebody busts out of a tournament, the clown walks up to the person doing the walk of shame and hands them like a single red balloon. It's like the fucking saddest shit ever.
The balloon becomes a shorthand for busting out, or like any like ultimate tragedy happening is a balloon, a red balloon. And then red balloon emojis started appearing when people died on Twitter. Like there would be obituary tweets about, great guys, a family man, good for his kids, good with his kids. Hate to see him go so young. Red balloon. And sometimes it would be like, some asshole politician would die, at least he was a real piece of shit his whole life. Red balloon,
And I think the red balloon was actually an extension of the Sad 5.
Yeah. Sad 5 was an invention of my wife, Heather Winna. She came up with this idea, like there are these moments where you want to express condolence or commiserate with somebody, but you don't want to have to articulate all of the reasons. You don't want to have to like go through the whole thing. You just want somebody to know that you're with them in their suffering or whatever. And she came up with the idea of the Sad 5, which I totally fucking love.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little demonstration of the Sad 5. Say my brother just died.
Man, my brother's got cancer.
I have to say, when Brandon moved away, it didn't really change our relationship that much. Like, we would still communicate with each other by text a lot. I mean, not seeing him in person didn't really seem to take the shine off of our friendship that much, because I still knew what was going through his head, and I still knew what he was up to, and it was still, gratifying to see him achieving things. I think there may have been a span of about a year and a half where I didn't see Brandon in person, but then when I did see him, it was just exactly the same, like as though he was still living in the other room,
I feel like after I lost my mom, she was what love was for me. She just like wanted everybody in the house to feel happy and never want to leave, and always put everybody before her. And me not having like a dad in my life, really, I looked for a male, like older male counsel, I suppose, just someone to give me, like, point me in the right direction, kind of. It was just something that was missing. And I think Steve kind of embodied all of these things. Someone who can give me good advice because he has so much experience, and then also like that compassion that I lost when my mom passed. Just that kindness, and like, I just know no matter what, like, this is a person who's there for me with no agenda, like wants nothing from me. So, yeah.